Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I just want to first start out by saying, as somebody that's now working in the environmental movement, that I feel the need to acknowledge that many of the principles of the environmental movement are actually from the knowledge of indigenous people over thousands of years. So we may call this environmentalism, but this knowledge has been with us for many millennia, and I think some of us are trying to come back to realizing that this knowledge is of value in the present day, and it's actually of necessity. So I just want to acknowledge that before I start. The original topic that Richard had presented to me was how to build an effective movement, and I've been part of the People's Climate Movement here in the Greater Toronto Area. And when he proposed that, I thought, oh great, I'll get back to you when I figure that one out. But one thing I do want to focus on is around some lessons learned, because I think for all movements, whether it's environmental or social justice or other types of movements, effective movement building is about learning lessons and taking those on board and not doing the same things over and over again if they're not proven to work. So we have this problem of climate change, and climate science has been incredibly useful in illuminating the problem, the extent of the problem, how much time we have left to address the problem. And as such, for years, environmentalists have believed that they can just come armed with this climate science and convince people that if they would just engage with the science, they would see the light. And guess what? All the people that we are going to convince have been convinced. So we can't just keep doing this over and over and over again. I'm not trying to contradict Gord Perks. I absolutely agree with him that if you're getting into any field or activism, you should know your stuff. And I learned my stuff when I was getting into climate change work. However, in terms of our inability to effectively act on climate as a society, it's not a scientific problem. And so learning that lesson is really core to us moving on and being effective as a movement. This approach, in terms of bringing the information to people, is called sort of the information deficit approach or model. That means it assumes that the problem is that people lack information, and we've been shown from numerous studies that have been done in the Greater Toronto Area, in Canada, that that's actually not the case. People know what climate change is. They learn it in school. The public is aware of it. And people are on board with the fact that they believe that human beings are causing climate change, the vast majority of people. So trying to get them then to change because of this information and presenting it over and over again seems to me to be a little bit ineffectual, if that's where we're coming from. And this is often the approach that's taken with politicians and members of the public. The other thing about this approach is that it relies really heavily on persuasion. So let me put this to you. How many of you have tried to convince somebody of something and been unsuccessful? How many people? Huh? Yeah, I would find it hard to believe that anyone wouldn't put up their hand, because then you're just getting your way all the time, and that's not reality. So, so this is one of the challenges when we come to people with information or reasons, and we just lobby real hard, and we're not actually meeting them where they're at. And a lot of the other speakers have brought up this concept of meeting people where they're at. So what are we learning as a climate movement? I think we're learning that in addition to the science, in addition to the desire to protect our natural environment, there are many other reasons for people to act on climate change. It might be health reasons, it might be for their children's future, it might even be protecting their property. That's not something that resonates with me, but that might actually be a motivation for some people. So, it sort of starts asking the question of how much does it matter that we share the same reason to act on climate? Is it okay or not that my why might be different than your why? And if we start asking ourselves that question, it might actually change the way we interact with people to get them on board. So I would like us to just sort of think for a moment about the difference between persuasive approaches and evocative approaches. So with persuasive approaches, basically what I'm trying to do is take what's in me and put it into you. And sometimes activists try to do this in a really forceful way. I don't want to undercut the value of persuasion, particularly when we're talking about calling people out on things. There is a role for calling people out. There is a role for direct action. There are a lot of people, a lot of indigenous people and racialized people that have put their bodies on the line to draw attention and call out injustice. I'm not undercutting that in any way. What I'm trying to suggest is there's space for that when it's appropriate and it gets results, and there's space for evocative approaches. And direct actions can actually be evocative. And what I mean by that is evoking other people's reasons for change, their reasons to do something, the things that are intrinsic to them, whatever they may be, their deeply held values. So if we start introducing this in the climate movement, it sort of broadens the range of things we might do or the things we might engage on with other people. And why I think this is really important is that we're functioning in this highly polarized political and social environment. There's this mentality, if you're not for us, you're against us. It's very real. I mean, we see it very visibly in the US with Trump. It's also happening here where we live, this great divide. And the challenge with climate change is it's a collective problem-solving challenge. We actually need most people to get on board and find common ground so that we can move as a whole society towards a solution. The good news is that we really have everything we need to do that. The role of technology in climate change is a complex one. We've actually modeled it for the city of Toronto. We don't even need any new technology to get to a low carbon city in Toronto. This technical work has been done. So that's good news. But that comes back to my original point that this is not a scientific problem. It is a systems problem, a political problem, a social problem, and a cultural problem. The systems discussion can be a whole lecture, so I'm just going to probably skim the surface here. But basically, I feel that we are under tremendous pressure as a society just to keep consuming stuff. And the way we live, the buildings we live in, the way we move, it pollutes. And some of us pollute more than others. They have shown that the direct correlation, and when I say they, there's been research on this, multiple studies, happy to share them, that it's not only our will not to pollute that makes us green, it's actually our income. Income is correlated to pollution. So we look at the system, which ultimately leads to natural resources being extracted from the earth and causing carbon pollution. That's the system that we're living in. And while we can certainly do things individually that are meaningful, ultimately we need to see systems change, and we need our politicians to be on board in bringing about that systems change. And it can range from a whole load of things, from actually investing in public transit so that people don't get into their vehicles, to taxing the companies that pollute the most, to ensuring that every building that is built meets the Toronto Green Standard, and that our buildings aren't leaky and causing damage to the environment. So there's like a whole range of things. There's a lot more that can be said about political injustice issues, but I'm just going to leave it there for now because our time is short. But why do politicians not act on this? Well, it's what Gord Perks brought up. It's the fear that if they do certain things, they will not get reelected. Some of them are even undoing progress that has already happened. So we make progress and then it's not sustainable or it's not durable. So we have a systems problem, we have a political problem, so that brings it back to us. Like, how can we actually create the political will so that our politicians are responsive to the very real needs that are resulting from our need to move forward on climate change? And I believe that we really need a cultural groundswell. We don't have what we need right now. We need to build towards it, and that's going to mean engaging people that have not historically been part of the environmental movement and don't necessarily share our priorities. They may have an interest in acting, and so let me give you a few examples. It may be people who are tenants who are living in high-rise buildings who experience a lot of discomfort and health issues in heat waves, and they can't control the environment in which they're living. Those people may have an interest in acting on climate change. It may not be a traditional environmental interest. It may be people living in suburban areas that don't have access to regular transit, so they're getting into their cars and they're driving a lot. The challenge for environmentalists is finding those areas that connect with our goals and not trying to bring people towards us, but actually go towards people. And so the last concept that I'm going to leave you with is one of intersectionality. Now, this is a term that really merits a whole talk on its own. The idea has been brought up actually by previous speakers. It's been used to describe how people experience discrimination based on the interconnected nature of race, class, gender, and those concepts. I think it's also very relevant to climate change, because at the end of the day, we do all experience the impacts of climate change, but some of us experience them differently. And that depends on where we live, it depends on our identity, our income level, and many other factors. In our own city here, we have people that I have pointed out to are very vulnerable to heat waves. We have people whose property is not insured because they don't have a level of income where they can buy insurance. In our northern communities, in our Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario, people are losing access to their winter roads because the temperatures are not cold enough for the roads that go to the communities in the winter, and people are relying on those roads for supplies. So this is all something we need to bear in mind when we conceptualize the challenge ahead. Ultimately, I guess where I'm going with this is that we need to engage a lot more people in this collective problem. And for us in the environmental movement, that I think points to the fact that we need to let go of our scientific fact sheets. That's not going to bring in the numbers, and we need to spend more time on building relationships and understanding people and seeing how we can support those goals, which ultimately are connected to climate.